to an unpolished earthling. Today we'll be continuing on with the manifesto, Gaia United, a pragmatic path to a healthy future. In this episode, we'll be looking at the frequently asked questions and concerns. So I've had this idea for quite a long time, and whilst working on it, I talked with many people from all sorts of walks of life and different countries, and I also traveled to a few countries and talked with many different people in those countries as well, and I've definitely had a lot of questions about it. It's a pretty complicated idea, and I'm sure a lot of you have some concerns as well. I do feel like the majority of concerns I have are from people not quite understanding what I'm presenting. Hence this huge manifesto and these videos to try to explain it in detail. But even then, it's such a complicated idea that there's a lot of refining questions that if I'm speaking to someone in person, it's really easy to clarify things. Like this, not as easy. So I do have a frequently asked questions, but this does not cover everything that I'm sure you might want to ask me if you met me in person. If you don't find your question is answered here, and you don't find that the assumptions section clarified the issues with human nature and such, then please send me an email and or ask me a question in a comment, and I'll do my best to get back to everyone, because I would like everyone to understand this. Naturally, such an ambitious undertaking will receive a lot of criticism, and it should, for it has the potential to change the lives of everyone on Earth, and as such, it should be very carefully considered before acted upon. A few of the most common concerns raised by the people I have presented this to are: is this manifesto too candid? How do we power the transition? Can we really trust robots? What about natural gas, nuclear power, or coal mixed with carbon sequestration? Do we really have to rely on renewable resources alone? How do we survive the transition? What about the wealthy and powerful? Does the transition have to be sudden? And what about war? So let's get started here. First one, is the manifesto too candid? Some may think that this manifesto is too candid, for if the celebrities realize that they are paying for most of the city in the carrot section, they may argue for lower prices. Furthermore, once the stick has been read by large corporations, especially media, banking, and construction related, they may choose to boycott the city because of its intended side effects. The reason this explicit approach has been taken is to preemptively meet and defeat these fears, as if the stick or other loose-tongue parts of this manifesto were omitted. The fact is that they are a part of the plan, and as such, the truth would eventually be likely to be leaked to the public. Eventually. If this happened, those associated with the manifesto would be seen as trying to hide the truth, and it would destroy our credibility and prove us dishonorable. Rather, we must appeal to the power of boldness and truth. Let the celebrities know that they are overpaying for their houses, but let them know that they're doing this to enable the project to proceed, to play a pivotal role in achieving a new world of true freedom and democracy, to be heroes and champions of the earth, leaders among our great and tender species. With this approach, rather than have to bargain with and deceive our benefactors, we can praise them and offer them the possibility of donating more than necessary to the project so as to help it grow even faster. The same logic applies to the stick, referring to the previous videos I made a moment ago. Rather than act subversively in an attempt to fool the wealthy, let us make it obvious to everyone exactly what is going on and what our intentions are. If the wealthy think critically about what this manifesto suggests, they will see that if they ignore it, it could proceed and be successful, and they may be remembered for their ignorance. If they fight it, it would be obvious that they do not have the best interests of the majority of humanity in mind. This would inspire the masses to fight with greater passion for change, and once that change has come, the previously wealthy would be remembered for their inglorious actions. If they help with this plan, though, many of them could be among the first to get to live in the first of a new kind of city, and would have the peace of mind of living in a stable environment ever after. Furthermore, by openly aiding the transition, it would make it clear that they too are human and willing to aid in a revolution to a healthier, more equitable world. Thus, even corporations who will be asked to invest heavily in the project that threatens to remove all of their power will still see that in the long run, the new world that they will have the privilege of being a part of will be far greater of a reward than anything their power in the old world could have ever achieved. Next, how do we power the transition? And this is a very valid question, though it poses no threat to the success of the project. There are many options to satisfy the question, but first to establish the importance of it. The amount of energy required to transform all of our infrastructure and our landscapes into something that could be sustained by renewable resources alone is monumental. To use renewable resources to support our current population and use what is left to power the transformation would likely take centuries. I do not believe that the current human population is prepared to sacrifice generations of comfort and freedom for the sake of their great-great-grandchildren. I know a lot of people say that they would and they should, but I don't have that much faith in that just yet. It could happen, don't get me wrong, it is possible, I just think it's unlikely. I think that non-renewable alternatives will be more attractive. If, for example, we used our massive nuclear warhead stockpile and converted it for use in nuclear power plants, we would have many times more than enough energy to make the transition. I should clarify, by the transition I mean literally physically changing the infrastructure, recycling old cities like New York and London and rebuilding highly desirable, ecologically sustainable cities in their place or in another place but nearby. Obviously, due to the limited size of the Earth, a lot of the cities will be built on the former foundations of previous cities. Now, the downside of this is the risk of accidents, which can be greatly reduced through proper care, and the task of dealing with the toxic waste left over, which, a little bit of a wild idea, but for example, we could try firing it into space with a railgun and store it on a moon, or pack it in a ship with a solar sail and send it to the nearest edge of the visible universe. So yeah, railguns today are becoming more popular. They're mostly being used in the military as extremely destructive devices, but the concept is just an electromagnetically propelled gun, and the idea of shooting stuff into space with a cannon is also not that crazy. There was a Canadian gun maker who nearly built the biggest gun in the world to fire satellites into orbit. Okay, now the downside of this is the risk of accidents, which can be greatly reduced through proper care. For example, look at the design of, say, the Koeberg nuclear power plant in South Africa versus the design of the Chernobyl power plant, which obviously didn't do so well. And you'll see that the level of safety and forethought in the design is extremely different from one and the other, and so you'll get an idea that not all nuclear power plants are the same, and some can definitely be safer than others. That doesn't mean that there's no risk of accident, though. Also, no matter how well you're doing this, you're going to have toxic waste coming out of it, and for the worst of that radioactive material, one idea is to simply send it up into space, store it on a moon, or put it on a ship with a solar sail and point it at the edge of the universe and just send it off away from us. There's a lot of other things that we could do. Obviously, today we have not yet solved this problem, and the majority of the nuclear waste storage facilities in the world have are beyond their expected lifetimes. They were not designed to hold the stuff as long as they have been holding it, and many of them are starting to leak, and we were supposed to have a plan to fix that and replace all of those storage facilities, and I haven't checked in the last few years, but as far as I know, we don't have a plan yet. So although I feel that it is possible to do things to solve it, we haven't yet solved it, and that would need to be solved properly before we could do that. I do have faith, though, that we'll be able to solve that. Now, another less desirable option is to use coal, oil, and nuclear gas that we have left to get the construction done, and then offset the massive carbon emissions with an intensive CO2 sequestration effort. So the idea is we still have a lot of fossil fuels left, and we could use them up, or use most of them up, in powering this transition. We just have to be aware of the impact on the environment by doing that, which would be huge, And so we'd have to have a huge effort into cleaning the air and removing the carbon as we would go on with that. Basically imagine, I don't know exactly how much it would take, but if you think that the average city doesn't replicate in a year, right? The amount of new buildings and new roads is probably only a few percent of the area of the city for the average year. And if we're going to try to build an entire new city from scratch, and we want to do it quickly enough so that we can do this in a reasonable time frame, that amount of construction is massive. And so if we were to use the fossil fuels we use today, but increase that energy expenditure, we'd have a hard time not killing ourselves with the pollution into the air before we get that done. So that is not an attractive option, but it's not impossible if done carefully and properly. I do think, and again, I'm not an expert in either of these, but I do believe it would be actually easier to use nuclear power and find a way to clean up that waste, even if it means putting it into ships to take into space. And obviously that's extremely risky as well, but I think we can do something with that more easily than we could use the sheer amount of fossil fuels required for this transition and still keep our atmosphere in habitable conditions. But people who study those things specifically can do that math and find the answer. So I'm not going to tell you which is the best way to go. I'm just saying there's options and they all have problems that need to be fixed. Another alternative is to tap the power of a volcano. Again, not going into the fine details of how, because it's also very risky, but simply put, there's a lot of geothermal heat being released near a volcano, and if you could tap into that heat to use steam to power generators, you can get a whole lot of power for free. So there are things like that as well. Oh yeah, I went on a really big tangent here about moving that power around. So for example, if you were to tap a volcano, well, there isn't a volcano in every city, you need to move that power. The further you send that power, the more resistance that it will usually encounter along the way, and you will lose power. So you can't really have a power line from Japan going to Ohio to power their cities. And if we only had a few volcanoes we were tapping for an extreme amount of power, we'd still have the problem of moving that power to the rest of the world. There is the idea of Nikola Tesla's long-distance wireless energy transmission, which has not been experimentally proved at that level to date. We have low-scale wireless transmissions, such as wireless phone chargers. Also, radios do send a small amount of power over very long distances, but not enough to power your house at the moment. We also have lasers that can send power. We also have microwaves that can send power. So there are many different ways that we're getting to do this, but the idea that Tesla had of a basically global transmission system that you could tune into to tap into whatever amount of power you needed, that hasn't been reproduced. And if we were to go with something like a volcano power plant in one location to power vast areas around it, we'd need something like that. So we might not have that as easily as we think. So to go back to answering our question, there are a few options we have to power the transition. It is essential that we solve this problem because there is going to be an enormous amount of energy required in a short time to transform the world into something sustainable fast enough to prevent a global ecological catastrophe. So we need to solve this problem, and I don't have an exact solution, but either using fossil fuels and then cleaning up that mess, or using nuclear power and then cleaning up that mess, or using alternative renewable resources like volcanoes and things like that, and finding a way to distribute that power effectively could work. Which of those is the best solution? I don't know, because I'm not an expert at all of these things. And I do know that there are real problems with each of them. Like nuclear, if we were to send our nuclear waste into space and what we sent it in had an issue and lost integrity, blow up in the atmosphere, we'd have nuclear waste raining down on us, and that would suck. If we go with the fossil fuels and we are not able to sequester the carbon at the rate we need to, we might heat up our planet so much so quickly that there's nothing we can do to stop the heat basically a positive feedback loop which keeps getting the planet hotter and hotter and hotter until it turns into a giant steam ball. So there are serious problems, but at least there are possibilities. It's not that there is no source of energy that could power this. There are a few. The question is, how do we do it in the safest way possible? So let's move on here. Next one, can we really trust robots? Simple answer, yes. Now, today, the advancements in AI are proceeding pretty incredibly. And so what I want to clarify is I'm not talking about AI. I'm talking about a conventional robot. Now, AI may be used to control a robot, but we don't need AI for a robot to work. So let's go over this real simply here. Our computers, cars, airplanes, cameras, and all sorts of other products which require great care and precision to produce are almost entirely built by robots today. Many of our airplanes even fly by autopilot, and some of the most advanced military aircraft in the world would be incapable of flight if it were not for high-speed computer-calculated robotic-activated aerodynamic adjustments. Look up the F-16, for example. Its design is unstable. If it was flying with nothing helping it, it shouldn't be able to fly straight and stay in the air. But by being inherently unstable, it becomes incredibly maneuverable, and having a really great computer that can make micro adjustments to all of its control surfaces in split seconds constantly while it's flying, it's able to do amazing things. But without the computer, it couldn't fly. So the robots of science fiction that attack their creators may indeed be a possibility, but one that hinges on advances in artificial intelligence so extreme that the result is nearly indistinguishable from natural sentience. Now, I'm not one to say what science cannot achieve, but I can point out excessiveness. So what I'm saying here, and in the last few years things have really accelerated with AI, but what I'm trying to get to is we don't need the kind of AI that would be capable of turning on us in order to have the robots that we do need to transition into a sustainable future. So we don't need to make that kind of stuff. We don't need to program it to be smarter than us. I don't want that in this, and we don't need that. And if we don't have that, then the robot you have will only do what you tell it to do. And yes, it can hurt someone. It can make a mistake. There can be accidents. Most of those will be the programmer's fault, or the designer's fault, or the architect's fault. Or someone, basically an accident. The chance of the robot becoming self-aware and deciding to eliminate humanity is not possible unless you have an advanced AI. And again, we don't need that for this. So the robots we would use would be safer and simpler. I ad-libbed that, but I'm just making sure it's exactly what I got here. Alright, yeah, we'll leave it at that. Yes, AI can be scary. No, we do not need AI-capable robots to help us with the problem discussed here. Now, what about natural gas, nuclear power, or coal mixed with carbon sequestration? Do we have to rely on renewables alone? Now, we just talked about power a moment ago in terms of the transition, and the transition is a temporary phase as we go from the infrastructure we have now into the infrastructure that is sustainable in the future. But once we're in that future, do we really have to only consume what we can get through renewable resources? And this question begs multiple answers. One part is the desire to use more energy than an equal portion of the Earth's biocapacity. If we burn fossil fuels for as long as we can, then at least we and our children, and maybe their children, and maybe even their grandchildren, might be able to live in a much greater material abundance. So let's say we design a city, it's ecologically sustainable, the whole world is healthy and happy, and we're good. If you could have more, because we still have some fossil fuel left over, why not, right? So this is a question of ethics. My position is that so long as the ecological footprint does not exceed one's portion of biocapacity, then if one is able to get more energy from other sources, so be it. In the situation of fossil fuels, one would have to sequester all of the carbon emissions using less than the amount of energy produced by the power plant, and then consider the energy and space required to build and maintain a power plant, then would have to figure out how many people one would need to contribute enough energy to the project to get it started, and how much of a benefit could be derived from it. Now, ideally, the website would be capable of figuring out all of these calculations pragmatically, leaving the voter to merely request the desired outcome. And let me just clarify that. So, if we have a coal power plant, and we'll pretend for a moment that there's a stockpile of coal that's already been mined out of the ground, we don't have to go mine it, we've just got it sitting there. The physical space that the power plant takes up, that prevents natural life from growing there. So that is reducing biocapacity, and it will reduce it for the entire lifetime of the plant, regardless of what pollution is being done. There simply cannot be a tree growing where you have a power plant growing. So to allow the existence of the power plant, the people involved have to vote to offset it. And since your personal vote is only about 100 meters by 100 meters, you're going to need a bunch of people together to vote and permanently sacrifice a portion of their energy to allow the existence of that plant. Now, let's say you do that and it's running, you are also creating pollution from that plant. So you're going to have to build a carbon sequestration and capture system that is taking power out of that plant to clean up the air as it's coming out of it. This does exist, and it'll be different depending on how you set it up, but you might lose something like 20% of the energy you're producing. So for the benefits you were getting, you've just written off a fifth of it so that you can clean it up again. Also, when you're using carbon capture and sequestration, that's going to take a little bit of space as well, because you need somewhere to put the stuff, and so you're going to have to make your power plant even bigger and have even more of a permanent impact being accommodated. If you're able to do all of that, and you find that the energy that you get out of it is still more than all of that you're putting into it, and it's actually worthwhile, there's no problem with you doing it. You and your community have made sure that there's no impact on the rest of the planet by doing it, and you're getting a benefit from it. All the power to you. If you're unable to set that up in a way that it is efficient enough, then you're actually going to waste more of your time and energy trying to run the thing than you get out of it, and it's not worth it. So there's a variety of factors that could make this worthwhile or not worthwhile, and each one would be a unique case. Now, let's say the source is nuclear power. One would have to come up with a plan to deal with the waste that was acceptable to the rest of the planet, on top of considering the same things as a fossil fuel scenario. What I mean by that is, in this voting system, everyone who is affected gets a say. If in your local community you all want to wear red hats, that does not matter to the rest of the world. No one else gets to say. They don't have a right to tell you whether or not you can wear a red hat, because it's just not part of their life. But if you're going to use a nuclear power plant and there is a chance that it could have an accident, and there is a chance that that accident could negatively impact the entire planet, then every human being on the planet gets a direct say in whether or not you're allowed to do that. So that'll be more complicated than a coal power plant, where as long as you're able to ensure you're not polluting, then you know you're not harming anyone else, and then no one else really has to have a say. Now, in the case of the volcano we mentioned earlier with power sources, people might find it actually a very attractive idea. The scale of building a power plant off of a volcano is massive. That's a huge project, it's a dangerous project, it's a difficult project, but imagine you were able to do it successfully. The amount of energy you get out of it every single year would be massive, and it would last a long time. And it's not causing pollution, because all the pollution coming out of the volcano was already coming out of the volcano, so you're not responsible for that. So that might be pretty attractive. And in the long run, unless we do rely on things like that volcano power, which is still technically renewable energy, but if we don't do that, then eventually we're going to run out of the other sources. So it makes sense to design a system that works for the forever than only designing a system that works for the next couple hundred years. But again, that's not up to me to say. So that's the great thing about this voting system, is so many things are possible. It's more about what is possible than what all the rules will actually be. Next question. How do we survive the transition together? If we take advantage of the website ahead of time, we can pragmatically arrange that everyone's needs are taken care of, and perhaps even an equal distribution of reasonable wants provided for during the transitional period. If we work together to the best of all of our abilities, we should have no great no great difficulty in achieving this worthy task. So the transition is definitely the most important part of all of this. It's incredibly complicated, and it's so challenging to talk about because if you use the system of Gaia United, you're designing your future. So we know that we get to a healthy world, we get to a happy world, we get to a place that makes sense. But getting there from here, that's incredibly difficult and incredibly complicated, and there are so many ways that it can happen that I can't be the one to say what it will be. But if we work together, we can decide together how it will be and what we want to do with it. And just for an example of extremes here, if we decided that, number one, we need to be sustainable, and that requires cutting all of our consumption down immediately, like tomorrow, and we just don't drive our cars anymore, we're walking around, we don't have lights, like I don't have lights on in my apartment anymore because I'm trying to conserve that energy. That would be so extremely difficult. And to try to build new cities from scratch whilst doing that with that energy budget, it might work, but it might take hundreds of years because we'd only have a tiny bit of energy each day to work with to start making that change. If we use nuclear power and fossil fuels and everything else to make the change, we can make the change happen very quickly, and it would be a lot more comfortable. But the impact on the planet during that change might be too much for us to handle. So finding that balance between doing it carefully and doing it quickly is something that we're all going to have to talk about, and that's it. We can definitely survive if we work together. If we don't work together, and I'm the only one in the world who wants to make a sustainable future, and the rest of the world doesn't give a crap, well, we don't get to live, like, look at the planet in 200 years from now and see where we'd be if we keep going the way we're going now. Next question is, what about the wealthy and powerful? The most common objection to the vision presented in the manifesto is that it will just never happen because people don't change. Elaboration on the objection, that when I ask them to explain more, usually points out that people are selfish and power corrupts. So there will always be people who fight for and gain control over others. The ones in control now don't care for ideas of equality, and since they are the only ones with the power to finance or authorize this project and its goals, it will never happen. I hear that one a lot. That's like I said, the most common objection is people do not believe in people, and it's not just people in general, specifically the wealthy and powerful, because of the, I don't know if you call it a truism or an idiom, I'll look up that figure of speech later, but the idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I kind of agree with that. It's hard to imagine at least the temptation for corruption to not be there when there is a imbalance of power. So this objection is strong considering our historical context, but it's invalid on two counts. One, nothing never changes, everything's always changing, and also even if people are selfish, we can use that selfishness to move forward. Being selfish does not prevent this from happening. For the first part, people are not essentially selfish, power-hungry creatures. We are far more complicated than that. Just as much as we are power-hungry, selfish, cruel, merciless, vicious, violent, disrespectful, and stupid, we are also intelligent, brave, caring, nurturing, merciful, tender, gentle, kind, unselfish, and sharing. Our environment, both physical, social, and mental, heavily influence our actions. But even these things do not determine our fate, for there are good people that arise out of the harshest conditions, as well as foul people raised with the greatest freedoms and comforts. Even today, there are egalitarian cultures, pacifist cultures, and millions of people who actively give their time or money to charity, other cultures that express tyranny and war. If we look at history and how things have never changed, we will see instead that things have made a steady and remarkable progression from a time when every day was a life or death struggle between our own tribes and the forces of nature, to a century that has witnessed wars that not only divided some people, but brought many more groups together on both sides, and resulted in a globe that actively, though not without its challenges, participates in dialogue in the United Nations. The World Wars actually resulted in the world coming together instead of permanently dividing the world. On the whole, humanity has never before cooperated so much and been so aware of its many cultures. We have also never been so aware of our planet and our biosphere. If anything, by looking at the past, it is only clear to see that things do change, us especially, and that we have been making reasonably steady progress towards a consciously united globe. What that will look like exactly, no one knows. Conceivably, we could become a one-world culture with one language and one way of life, or we could become an interconnected system of myriad unique cultures. The system proposed in this manifesto will not determine what the future will look like either, but provides an efficient means of achieving global dialogue on the topic to facilitate the process. The second part is based on one of the first arguments in economics. Different people, or cities or cultures, have different characteristics. This is the appealing to selfishness part. And these differences result in different people being better at producing different things. This difference is called comparative advantage, and it is the most powerful reason for people to trade, or groups to trade. If Bob, for example, can produce twice as many potatoes as Jill, and Jill can produce twice as many carrots as Bob, then by both focusing on what they are good at, and then trading their surplus, both Bob and Jill can enjoy more potatoes and carrots than either of them could produce alone. The next step gets a little complicated. In the long run, if this manifesto does not succeed and we do not adopt a global economy, then only the wealthiest people could afford to move into sustainable cities. The rest of the population must live in a subsistence manner, which in some densely populated locations will likely result in a loss of life. In the decades and centuries following, the world will have a much smaller population living in advanced cities. If we change the global system first and allow everyone to transition into new cities, then we will have a much larger technologically advanced population. The larger the population, the greater the variety of products produced and the more specialists there will be. So looking at the two options, it's obvious that the global market will be much richer in a world where everyone survives and makes it through the transition. Therefore, the wealthy elite, who enjoy a great material standard of living by holding wealth and power in the system today, will lose out in the long run if they stick to this economy. If they support the transition instead, then they can ensure that they will be among the first to enter sustainable advanced cities, and be assured that once the rest of the world has followed suit, the material standard of living will be far higher than ever before. Essentially, it is in the selfish, material best interest of wealthy and powerful people in the current economy to aid the transition into a new global economy, even if that means giving up their wealth and power in the process. And for a moment, imagine you could only ever hear one song on the radio, and that's it. And you could only ever have one kind of food to eat for dinner, and that's it. And then start to think about all the different music you do hear and all the different food you do eat, and how it comes from likely all over the world. And I made a simple curry the other day, but the potatoes were from South America, the spices are from India, the chicken was probably originally from around Europe before it was brought over here. So there's so many pieces of the meal I made which wouldn't be possible without global trade. And just imagine that extends to everything in our economy. So imagine how boring life would be if there are only a few people. Also, if you only have 100 people in your village, how many doctors do you have? And how many of those doctors specialize in neurological diseases versus how many are optometrists versus how many work on bone diseases, right? So the more people you have, the more specialization you get, and the more riches through that diversity that there is in the world. And that's why I think that people should want to ensure a future where the majority of humanity gets to survive, rather than looking to a future where only they survive. Does the transition have to be sudden? I have frequently been asked why I don't stop thinking about the gigantic picture for a moment and just try something small. Just build an example community, for instance, and go from there. This has frustrated me, as these people have not understood my argument, and so I must tear it apart and improve it and try again. And that right there is, I want to make this easy for everyone to understand. So when I do explain myself and people ask me questions that I think might seem silly, it's actually my failing, not theirs. It means I did not express myself adequately enough. So I gotta try again and again, and these videos are me, yet again, trying to find another way to get all this out here. Now the reason is this, for why the transition has to be sudden. To build a community that is not completely self-sufficient, that community must be compatible with the communities that it is dependent on. A new suburb with net zero energy, for example, would by necessity be attached to a pre-existing modern city where the inhabitants can buy food and clothing and work. For even a city of 5,000 people, you'll not find an orthodontist or an electric toothbrush manufacturer. Thus, to continue to enjoy the fruits of a large market, the suburb becomes dependent on an obsolete city. Its inhabitants will likely still drive cars long distances to work in their nearest metropolises, and the houses themselves might be net zero, but the lifestyle in all likelihood will not be. Basically, I'm saying that for this to work at all, you need to have a large enough community that can be self-sustaining, which requires multiple cities to be built. And as we discussed in the carrot and stick section, it's impossible to build those cities unless we have a radical change to the global economy, which in turn cannot happen until we achieve critical mass. So this is why I say to the eager green developer, save your energy for when you can build something to stand the test of time, because I don't think that trying to build something small scale now is really going to work, and we may have to redo it all over again when we are ready to work. So the transition will be gradual as we all become aware and considerate, but then like floodgates opening, it will become dramatic when we have collectively made up our mind about what to do. So what I mean is, right now I can't break ground on a new city. Tomorrow I'm not breaking ground on a new city. When we are ready to build one new city, that's not going to solve our problems. When we're ready to build 10 new cities, that's a good start, but that's not really going to solve our problems. When we're ready to change the global economic system, to change our socio-economic paradigm, when we are ready to embrace a new way to make decisions about what we're allowed to do and how we're allowed to do it, once we do that, then it becomes very easy to do everything else, and we don't have these huge financial burdens in the way of getting stuff done. So that's why I feel like the way this transition is actually going to go is kind of silently for a while. It's going to be not silent, but quiet. It'll be talking. It'll be you watching this video, sharing it with the people around you, doing research for yourself on things I brought up that you'd like to learn more about. And then that discussion spreading around the world until all of humanity has thought, hey, there is a better way to do this. We can play a game where we all get to live. We all get to come together as equals. We get to make something beautiful, sustainable, and healthy. And I think that's a lot better than this other game we're playing now, where one person gets to profit monumentally while other people are suffering and even starving to death, right? So once that's in our minds and we agree that, yeah, we want this new way to do it, like that, then we just abandon the old system and start again. Start with a new one. But until we're at that point, I don't have the power to make the changes I'm talking about, and you alone don't have the power to make the changes I'm talking about. So that's why, for now, I feel like it's more about spreading the idea than anything else. And then the last of our questions here is, what about war? Huge, complicated one, and I'm not going to pretend I have a perfect answer here. But this question, as I was saying 10 years ago, amuses and concerns me. It was asked of Jacques Fresco in the 1974 interview with Larry King, and his response is very similar to mine. We both believe that war is caused by conflict due to scarce resources, and that if the world were abundant for everyone, there would be little cause for it. This is perhaps a very naive outlook, but it's all we have. In the world as it could be, based on the system I proposed, there is no global government made of people, there is no one person in charge, there is no global set of rules or an enforcement agency beyond the make sure we don't kill the planet one and ensure that we share things equally. This means that if one group attacked another, nothing need necessarily be done about it. However, by virtue of our global communications devices, which facilitate the ongoing preference vote, the victims may appeal to the rest of the world for help. If the rest of the world or some parts of it decide to intervene, they have the freedom to do so. As such, a large group of people could attempt to administer and enforce a global justice system, but only if the vast majority of the planet agreed with it and supported it would it have the power to be effective. So, will there be war in future? I hope not. There is no need for it, though it is a possibility, but it's a much less likely one in the future than today. The other part of this question is in regard to war today. Long-standing hatred between certain groups that must be addressed before we can live in peace. I believe that the solution here is to quell the fear of both sides, provide assurance of equal respect for the rights of each party and an agreement of tolerance. If each side knows that they never have to talk with, deal with, or fear the other, then they can focus their energy on creating the local futures that they want to experience. Furthermore, due to the global communication network, the possibility of reconciliation in the future will always be available. For the matter of war, I cannot guarantee that it would be abolished, but I hope and have great reason to believe that we are entering an age where war is obsolete. So there's also a couple more notes here. One, there are wars for many different reasons. You could create a war because one person had an argument with another person, and the people having the argument were influential and powerful enough to get other people to fight on their behalfs. There is war over land. There is wars over resources. There's wars over economic zones. There's wars over religion. There's so many reasons for war. And in the future, I'm talking about the things that would be solved is land. Everyone would have an equal right to land. So you wouldn't be able to go to war to take over a country, because that's just not the way land ownership works anymore in the system. It wouldn't make sense anymore there. Wars over religion. I can't say that one would go away, because the system I'm talking about is not a spiritual or religious system. So nowhere in this manifesto do I tell everyone they have to believe the same thing. In fact, I encourage people to believe what they want to believe, which means we will have different belief systems and some of them conflict. The need to go to war over it, though, seems very irrational, especially when there isn't much gain. So on the one hand, I'd say that I don't think it makes sense. On the other hand, I can't say that everyone who will ever be born in future will be a rational person. What I can say, though, is the power to go to war would be dramatically reduced. So if you think of, say, the United States, and you look at their military budget, and you look at the amount of energy expenditure on maintaining all of those weapons and those armies, that, as a portion of their entire impact on the planet, is a pretty big proportion. So if you as an individual were choosing how to allocate your energy, and you realize that you need to put 15 or 20% of your energy to having the ability to go to war, to have weapons and to have soldiers, that means that you might not be able to have ice cream anymore. You might have to give up coffee. You might have to have a smaller house. Maybe you're never allowed to go on vacation or go snowboarding again, because so much of your energy is being spent on just this purely destructive purpose. Now, it's your freedom and your choice if you want to do that to support that, but I don't think it's a very attractive thing for most people. And when you realize where else your energy could go, you can, to say, even if you were to just put it into your local parks, when you step outside your house, you would live in a much more beautiful environment by not spending that money on war. And when people have to make those sacrifices personally, instead of a government who just tells you what you're spending on war and takes your taxes from you and you don't get a say, like they do in the United States, I think people would make very different decisions. And then if you're in a situation where, as a warmongering person who likes war, if you don't get the support from other people and you don't get that energy and you can't make those weapons and you can't do that stuff, you might find that your capacity to go to war is greatly reduced. And if you do go to war, the destruction you're able to cause is greatly reduced. So even though I cannot pretend that there won't be people in the future who have cause to go to war, I do believe that the future would make it very personally costly to even consider supporting that idea. And I think that there would be a lot of encouragement for people to spend their energy on other things. So in that way, the system I'm proposing would likely have far less war and far less destructive wars and deadly wars than the system we're in today, which actually profits off of war and thus encourages war. In fact, there was recently a time where the American government was selling weapons to both sides of a conflict in the Middle East, which is ridiculous. Like, essentially American-backed forces fighting American-backed forces because America doesn't really give them. Because America doesn't necessarily care about what they're fighting about as long as it's making money, because in this system, money is all that matters. And I don't like that system. So yeah, I do believe that what I'm proposing is far better for war, in terms of removing war from the world, but I'm not going to pretend to tell you that in the system I'm talking about there would never be conflict. Now, on the other hand, if there is conflict, the whole world gets to know about it, and the world gets to respond. So if you don't like people bullying other people, you could choose to put a portion of your energy towards having a global security force which does nothing but prevent people from having conflicts. So when one group is attacking another group, the people being attacked could say, hey, we need help, and there is a resource to go and help them. I believe that that's likely to happen, but it's not something built into the system. It's something you as an individual would choose to vote your energy towards, and if only one person in the world wants to do it, well, it's not going to be effective. If the majority of humanity wants that kind of protection, then it will be effective because there'll be the energy and support for it. So in that way, I talk about justice in the future, in the system I'm talking about, as spontaneous justice, where it is truly people responding from their own human nature and their own decisions, deciding to help people and intervene when necessary. And if in this future no one helps anyone, then I guess people suck and humanity is not a great species. I don't believe that will happen, though. I have more faith in people than that, and I believe that in the future the majority of humanity will prove to be good people. And if anything, wouldn't it be nice to have evidence from an experiment where people are actually free to act instead of people being controlled by strict governments and separated in that way? So yeah, I think that what I'm talking about is far better, even in terms of war, although yes, I'm not going to pretend that war will disappear completely. Alright, that's it for the frequently asked questions. Next, we talk about the addendum.